I didn't ask why. That's the distillation of the story I'm about to tell, and I want to give it to you at the beginning because I think the setup matters less than the mechanism. The specific circumstances of my situation are mine, but the mechanism, the not asking why, belongs to a much larger category of human experience that I think is worth examining honestly. I accepted a version of something without asking where it came from. The something was a belief about my own professional capability. Specifically, that I was not suited for leadership. That I was a strong individual contributor and a weak manager, that the skills required for one did not translate to the other, that I should orient my career toward depth rather than breadth, toward execution rather than direction. I had accepted this belief so thoroughly that it had become architectural. It organized my professional decisions for most of my late 20s and early 30s. I didn't pursue leadership opportunities. When they arose, I declined or deflected. I built a career on the assumption that this belief was accurate, and I never, in all that time, asked why I believed it. The reason I didn't ask is that the belief had the feeling of something arrived at through experience rather than something imposed from outside. It felt self-known. The difference between a belief you formed yourself and a belief that someone else formed for you and which you absorbed can be very difficult to detect from the inside, especially when the belief has been part of your operating framework for long enough that you've built evidence for it through confirmation bias. What had actually happened, what I found out when I finally, in my mid-30s, sat down with a therapist and started pulling threads, was this. I had a manager early in my career who told me, directly and specifically, that I wasn't a leader. This wasn't a performance review finding or a gentle developmental note. It was a specific statement made in a context that gave it authority. She had worked with me for 18 months, she was someone I respected, and she said it in a way that communicated finality. Not an assessment to work on. A fact. I was 26. I didn't have the context to evaluate the claim critically. I didn't have the professional experience to say, this is one person's read of one person at one point in time, and it deserves exactly the weight of that rather than the weight of an objective truth. I absorbed it. I integrated it. I built my career around the assumption that it was accurate. She may have been right in some narrow sense, about me at 26, in that specific context, in that specific role. What she didn't have the right to tell me, and what I didn't have the wisdom to resist, was the implication that it was permanent and definitive. That it described something essential about me rather than something conditional about a particular moment. The therapy conversation that started the unraveling was unremarkable in its setup. I was discussing career plans, and my therapist asked why I wasn't pursuing a leadership opportunity I'd mentioned. I gave my standard answer. She asked, "When did you decide that?" I didn't have an answer. The belief was so old that I didn't have an origin story for it. She said, "Can you remember the first time you thought that about yourself?" And I could. I remembered the specific conversation with the specific manager, with remarkable clarity, because it had been significant enough to organize the decade that followed. The work from there was, examining whether that assessment was still accurate. Not taking it at face value either way, not dismissing it because it came from one person in one moment, not accepting it because it had felt like authority. Actually looking at the evidence. Actually asking what leadership required and whether I had it. The answer, which took some time to arrive at honestly, was, more than I'd thought. Not perfect, not easy, not without areas that needed development. But not the categorical absence I'd been operating from. I've been in management for 4 years now. It's work I find meaningful and that I'm, by available evidence, reasonably good at. The specific manager who told me I wasn't a leader was operating from a read of me at 26 with limited context. She may even have been trying to be kind in some misguided way, redirecting someone she thought was setting themselves up for failure. But her belief became my belief. And her belief about me at 26 shaped who I was at 35, without me ever asking whether it should. Ask why. About all of it. About the beliefs that feel most certain, most built in, most like self-knowledge. Those are the ones most worth examining. Because some of the things you know about yourself aren't yours. They were handed to you by someone who may not have known you at all. What I've learned about the pattern I've described, the specific mechanism, the way it operates below the level of conscious decision, is that it doesn't respond to willpower alone. Willpower is useful for short-term resistance. For the long-term restructuring of a deep habit or tendency, you need something different. You need to understand what the pattern is doing for you. What it's providing. What it would cost you to give it up. Every destructive pattern has a function. That's the uncomfortable truth. We don't maintain things that don't serve us in some way, even if the service is maladaptive, even if the cost is greater than the benefit. The pattern of staying when I should have left, or not seeing what was in front of me, or following the feeling without examining it, each of those had a function. Protection from loss. Management of fear. Maintenance of an identity that required me to believe certain things about myself or others. Understanding the function doesn't excuse the pattern. But it makes the change possible in a way that pure willpower doesn't. Because once you understand what the pattern is doing, you can ask, is there another way to meet that need? Can I get the protection, or manage the fear, or maintain whatever I need to maintain, through a behavior that doesn't cost me what this one does? Usually the answer is yes. Usually there is a better path to the same destination. You just have to be willing to find it, which requires first being willing to admit what you were trying to reach. That's the hardest part. Not the change itself. The honesty that makes change possible. I'm still working on it. I think everyone is. The work doesn't end. It just gets more familiar. And familiar, at least, is something you can navigate. Even in the dark. There's a particular quality of mourning I've noticed in the period after working through something significant. A specific lightness. Not happiness, exactly, not the performed kind, not the kind that requires circumstances to be good. Something more elemental, the sensation of being present in your own life instead of slightly beside it. I chased that sensation for years before I understood that it wasn't something that arrived. It was something you had to create the conditions for. And the conditions are, at their core, very simple: honesty with yourself about what's happening, willingness to feel what the situation asks you to feel, and the courage to take the action you know is needed even when the action is uncomfortable. Simple to describe. Difficult to execute. Difficult in ways that are specifically, personally yours, in the ways your history makes difficult, your particular fears, your particular blind spots. But that difficulty is not a wall. It's a map. The places where you find the most resistance are usually the places most worth going. I spent time going around the resistance. Managing it, distracting from it, building elaborate structures to not have to walk through it. The structures consumed more energy than walking through the resistance ever did. I just didn't know that until I started walking through. The story I've told here is the story of one chapter. One specific set of choices in one specific situation. But the mechanism, the way the pattern operated, the way I enabled or avoided or mistook or missed, that mechanism has appeared in other forms in other chapters. It probably will again. Not identically, but recognizably. What I carry forward is the recognition itself. The specific texture of the thing when it's happening. The way my body registers it before my mind catches up. The particular quality of the avoidance or the escalation or the wrong certainty. Learning to recognize the mechanism faster. Acting on the recognition sooner. That's the work. And it's worth doing. Every single time. I want to leave you with the thing I wish someone had told me earlier. Not a formula. Not a framework with steps. Something simpler and harder. Most of what we avoid in ourselves is survivable. The feeling we don't want to feel, the conversation we don't want to have, the truth we don't want to acknowledge, we avoid them because we believe, on some level, that having them will break something. That the reality is too large to hold. That if we stop managing around it, it will overwhelm us. It usually doesn't. What breaks us is more often the managing, the ongoing, exhausting, expensive work of keeping something at bay. The thing itself, when we finally let it in, is almost always more survivable than the anticipation of it. I know this from experience. From specific, personal, hard-won experience. The thing I dreaded most in the story I've told you was not as large as the managing of it. The moment I stopped managing and started facing was difficult, yes. But it was bounded. It had a shape. It moved. Things you manage around don't move. They sit in exactly the same place, requiring the same amount of energy to maintain, for as long as you're willing to keep paying. I stopped being willing. And what was underneath was not a catastrophe. It was just the truth. And the truth, it turns out, was something I could hold. So can you.